Welcome to The Golden Shadow, the podcast about psychology, philosophy, myth, mysticism, and mystery. My name is Arran Rogerson.
And I'm Alyssa Polizzi.
Today we're talking about archetypes. Many of us are familiar with the idea of archetypes, but as usual, it's a more complicated concept than we might realize. But in the simplest terms, how might we define archetypes?
Archetypes are psychological organizing principles of our experience. So we can think about them as providing us with sort of instinctual framework for our behavior, our thoughts. Really refers to this way that we process information and organize life experience.
Right, so the way that we take in everything that's happening to us, the way that we take in our experiences, the way we take in our surroundings, all the information that we're encountering as we navigate through our life, we are organizing that information into meaning in some sense. We're making sense of our surroundings.
Yeah.
And to do that, we need some sort of architecture of psychology. Like, where do we place this information? How do we package this information? And that might be in terms of the objects of experience. We recognize people as people. We recognize trees as trees in some sense. This is very low down as far as how we talk about archetypes. It's sort of the nature of our psychology in some sense, the way that we organize our psychology.
The building blocks, the framework.
So this is a big concept. This is a conversation pretty much about psychology and how it works in its entirety, but most people know archetypes in some sense as referring to patterns of stories in some sense, which are really like a reflection of the archetypal world.
Yeah. We can think that there is sort of this kind of layered hierarchy of experience, and really at the top of that is the actual archetypal framework, the structure itself, and what we interact with and what we materialize out of that is the representations, the manifestations of that archetypal pattern. And that's often what we tend to characterize in mythology or motifs and stories, these dynamics that feel archetypal to us, like the hero's journey or the wise old man or the benevolent king, where we go, oh yeah, those are archetypes, but actually those are archetypal images.
So we're familiar with this notion. Most people who are familiar with Carl Jung, definitely people who think about mythology, people who are fans of pop culture even.
Right.
There's a recognition of formula.
Yes.
Formulae, maybe. People understand that movies specifically have a formula to them that is, in some sense, varied over and over again in infinite ways. The hero's journey is the most obvious, most well-known example of this, but there's a formula, and you can vary that formula quite a bit in the details while maintaining the core structure of it. And that core structure, in some sense, is an expression of an archetype. So we have Star Wars, we have Harry Potter, we have The Hobbit, any famous hero's journey story. We know that the details are different. We know that Luke and Harry are not the same person exactly. They have different backgrounds. They have different personalities, even in some regard. They have different arcs to their story, and yet they both have a pattern of the adventure that is tapping into something that is formulaic.
Right.
And that is a evidence that there is something in our psychology.
Yeah.
Something at the foundation of our psychology that dictates that we like this story in some sense.
And that it's shared. That's the big part of it too, is that this pattern, this framework seems to appear across culture and really across time, because we see it now in modern day, but we also see it appearing in stories from earlier generations and ancient times. And so those dynamics that we're interacting with, having that sort of primordial nature to it, and sort of belonging to the collective, which is to say that it's just inherently human. When you're born, you are born with the archetypes in their framework.
Right. So the archetype is something that's inherited
Yes.
The same way that the morphology of your body, the genetics that we readily recognize, we all have a structure to our bodies that's inherited from our parents. You have your parents' eyes. You have your parents' nose. Let's say we all have noses. We all have eyes. Most of us have 5 fingers on each hand, 5 fingers on each, 5 toes on each foot. This is all inherited physiological traits. The mind is no different.
Yes.
That we are inheriting archetypes in some sense as a structure of psychology.
Yeah.
And the archetypes that we inherit allow for the potential of the characters and motifs, the stories, the fiction, all these manifestations that we have in our culture. The archetypes allow for that. But the actual character itself, Harry Potter, for instance, is not the archetype because Harry Potter's not inherited.
Right.
We didn't inherit Harry Potter like in our mind, though we did inherit like the culture in some sense. So that's an important distinction, is that the archetype is inherited because the structure of our psychology, the structure of our mind is inherited. And that allows for the creation of all these characters and stories and motifs.
Yeah, exactly. And it's what kind of seems to connect us to some sort of shared experience so that we start to build up collectively culture and dynamics of society. From that, we build religion and spiritual practice and dramas and mythology and even in more simple terms, ways of approaching the world that seem more fundamental and more basic in nature, sort of transcending that sort of mythological feel to more mundane aspects as well.
So if we try some examples, let's say we're going to consider the father as, let's say, an archetype.
Yes.
Even though it's more complicated than saying the father is an archetype. We're tapping into something much more primordial and deep.
Right.
That's beyond the father.
Yeah.
But still we can approach the concept of the father and say, what's the archetype here?
Right. And we can think about the archetype of the father as representing these principles of authority, leadership, knowledge, organization, some sort of figure that maintains order. And then that manifests into the image of the benevolent king or your father, like your personal father or a father figure, religious leaders, things like that, just people who inherently pull those associations into them naturally from us. But the benevolent king or the religious leader, even your father, is not the archetype itself, but they hold the pattern of experience inside of them.
Right. So the father, we can think of that as being an expression of some sort of archetypal niche, or the archetype as an anchor almost for our psychology, or an anchor for our experience, or a core which has an orbit for which we place our experiences.
Yes.
And in the sense that we're born with this archetypal void or archetypal hole in some sense that is going to be filled by a father figure.
Yes.
Or that we're going to recognize in other people as being fatherly, or we're going to recognize it in stories as the king. And the king in some sense is occupying a father role, or the mentor in a story might have some sort of fatherly aspect of it. There's also just literally the father in the hero's journey. Yeah. There's often a father character who's killed, let's say, or something like that. But deities often have a fatherly aspect.
Yeah.
You might even say the Christian God is God the Father, and is in some sense playing off of this archetypal niche that we have in our psychology for a figure of, like you said, authority or rules or structure or judgment, but also like love, a combination of all these things that are very fatherly.
Right.
And if someone is born without a father, for instance, you can understand why this is difficult for a child and leads to a lot of struggle with life.
Psychological issues.
The child's looking for a father.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that speaks to this underlying collective universal thing that we all have, which is the father, the archetype.
Yeah.
Something foundational to our mind, to our experience, by which we organize information in some way.
Yeah. And I think looking at family dynamics, especially, is a really good way to get a grasp, because the father and the mother, and if there are any siblings, the sort of family as a whole, is so initially experiential for us. Like when we're born, those are the first people that we know there, that we interact with. And before you can consciously really know who they are, there's an instinctual connection to them. The child inherently connects to the mother figure or to the father figure, and an interplay, this sort of reciprocity begins, where the mother is sort of enacting certain patterns towards the child, and the child,
Right, because the child is also archetypal.
yes,
Right.
yes, exactly. So that is like the one of the first manifestations of it. So if you're wanting personally to understand this dynamic of archetype better, really begin to look at the associations in your own family, father, mother, siblings, grandparents, even, I think, can be very powerful figures in that way too. And seeing that personal experience, and then maybe starting to push past that initial personal layer, and starting to think about the collective experience of what the archetype represents, what the archetype of the mother is for all people throughout mythology, throughout history, what that type of individual has come to represent for us. And it can help you to see why we might have certain expectations of our parents, especially why we might feel disillusioned when we realize how very human our parents can be, that they can make mistakes, that they can cause traumas, things like that. It kind of brings in the very human personal element with that powerful archetypal association that we naturally have to them.
So let's try maybe a more abstract example of an archetype. Not too abstract, but let's consider the notion of a thief.
Okay.
Let's say a thief is a character sometimes that we see in mythology, in our stories, in our movies. A character that is sneaky, maybe, a character who could be viewed very negatively as a thief.
Yeah.
Someone who's not playing by the rules,
Right.
someone who is taking advantage of others.
Yeah.
It could be a character that we actually find to be virtuous in some sense, like Robin Hood is in some sense a thief. But we might take this as an example of an archetype that's not so obvious as the father or the mother. Those are big archetypes, right? Because they're so foundational to everyone's experience. But the thief as a reflection of something that we instinctually recognize in people, in groups of people. We have a notion of rules. We have a notion of fairness that is very deeply ingrained in us. And so this kind of embodiment of someone who is being unfair or who is robbing the fruits of someone else's labor in some regard is also an archetype, or more accurately, an expression of some sort of archetypal pattern to our psychology. The recognition that there is a fairness to our social groups, and that there is someone who can break that rule in some regard. And that's how we see it in stories, perhaps. So perhaps Robin Hood is archetypally a thief, but also archetypally a hero, and there's sort of an interplay between those two things.
Oh, yeah.
Breaking the rules, but doing so because the rules are not good to begin with, and stealing from the rich because the rich should be stolen from in some regard.
There's kind of the need for that archetypal nature to sort of turn the usual framework on its head in some way, or to kind of come out on top, to use this sort of underhanded techniques, or, as you said, to steal from the rich. And I think what's really at play there usually is some sort of like balancing of the scales in some ways. I mean, it really depends on the story itself,
Right.
but when an individual is maybe up against incredible odds, that sort of different attitude or behavior that one might associate with that sort of devious thief-like quality, the trickery in a way also might be what helps bring in more inherent balance and harmony to the situation.
Sure. And there's an aspect of this scene in role-playing games, video games. There's a character you can choose to be, which is the thief character in some sense. And some people might like the idea of the identity that they have as someone who is sneaky and behind the scenes,
Right.
and maybe not the most obvious, or maybe not the leader, maybe not the person who's out in front and in the spotlight, but someone who's in the shadows.
Right.
There's sort of a tapping into some aspect of our psychology of there's something appealing about the person who goes a different path or goes their own way.
Right. And I think that also just shows that the varied possibilities of navigating life in a way that is still kind of like in line with the nature of doing well, or doing what the typical hero might do, but just in a different capacity, allows for it's just sort of like a multitude of experience for one to not be so stuck in a stereotype, like the hero with the big sword who's always out in front and saves the day by charging in and, beating on his chest, and everyone knows, there's different ways to interact with the environment and calling upon different skill sets and playing up to certain people's inherent nature, even, that still provides a sense of goodness or virtue, or at least a continuation of the story in a way that is positive. And you can even sometimes see in certain hero stories that the hero themselves might wear many of those different hats. Maybe they are sometimes the very obvious, glorious, virtuous hero, but other times they might be a little bit more trickstery or thief-like. And you might think, well, that's not very fair, or that's not a good attitude to take, or something like that. But it serves an important purpose, and sort of shows also, I think, the very human dynamic of individuals that we sometimes need to dip into our tool belt.
Right. The great variation in our identities.
Right.
The potential for so much variation.
Yes.
So something that's important to illustrate is that characters and motifs are not the only expression of archetypes. There are archetypes. You could apply this to really any aspect of experience at all, but you could think of stories as being archetypal. Obviously, the hero's journey is an archetypal story. We've already talked about that, and that's not necessarily just the hero as a character. The story itself is archetypal. The pattern itself is archetypal. The Hobbit is an archetypal hero's journey story, and it distills this pattern, this aspect of our psychology very effectively into the story of Bilbo. You could say Lord of the Rings, in some sense, is archetypal in a different way than The Hobbit. There's something about it. It's aesthetic. The more epic structure, the more like the world is at stake aspect of Lord of the Rings is something that we see that's been copied over and over again. Is the great epic fantasy adventure.
Yeah.
And these are all tapping into formulaic aspects of our psychology, distilling those aspects of our psychology, manifesting these patterns that are collective, that are universal, that we recognize in some sense. And another example might be pop music, right?
Yeah.
Like the Beatles as a band. There's something about the archetype of the band that's like tapping into something deeper.
Yeah, we see this sort of like group identity coming together with this formulation of the band, and everyone sort of playing their roles. Like we can even see it, on a sports team or in a band of heroes in a superhero movie. Like there's something about a group of powerful individuals who are sort of tapped into their own mastery or their own skill set that we find very valuable So we have, with the example of exploring the archetypal nature of music and this emergence of rock and roll and pop as this recognition collectively of something that is very inherent, that it took the world by storm, that each of the Beatles, and maybe arguably some of them more than others, became like gods in a way, right? Like we're like the incredible songwriting of John and Paul, and the guitar playing of George and Ringo, who kept it all together.
Right. Yeah.
They all play this role, and there's something inherent initially just to them as individuals, but then what they brought forward to us psychologically through sound, through music, that we can think about now that we're experiencing archetypal nature through music.
Right. So they discovered something that was hiding all along
Yeah.
in some regard, and they did it incredibly well. But the band as a phenomenon is something that's incredibly popular and has
Yes.
become incredibly popular. And I don't think that could have been predicted. I don't think people could have understood that. But there's something about these four dudes, maybe five of them, and they're rebellious and they're doing things that make the older generation like wag their finger.
Right.
They're growing their hair too long.
Yeah.
The music is too energetic.
Right. They're breaking the rules. They're kind of thief-like, right? They're in a trickstery in a way.
Definitely.
And they're certainly heroes to all of those kids who
Right.
loved them.
Right. There's something very sexual about it too.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
Not always, but in the case of the Beatles, in the case of rock and roll bands, there's definitely a sort of youthful rebelliousness, sort of hot young people breaking the rules that is tapping into something that's very archetypal for us. And that's very interesting. And then that's combined with all these other aspects of what we consider to be pop music. It's not just the music, but it is the music. I mean, there's the
Yeah.
pop song is archetypal.
Right.
It's been distilled into a format. It has a formula
Yeah.
that is verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, for instance. And that's been copied over and over and over again into literally like millions of songs.
Yeah.
And
it works for us. We
it
want to
works.
hear it over and over in all of these variations because it hits something very true.
yeah,
And that sort of longevity, that everlasting sort of quality to it is very sort of inherent. That sort of waves the flag, like, okay, archetypal pattern framework happening here.
exactly. It's like you can't deny that it's tapping into something that is a thing in archetype.
Yeah.
It's the song is something you can't deny that. And if people experiment. There's experimental music, of course, and there's like hardcore music where the song is maybe like 30 seconds long. And there's music where it tries to do a song that's like 10 minutes long, for instance, but you find like it just doesn't really seem to work as well. It's like,
Well, and I think it will work to a degree for some people, but will that ever take hold of the world? Will it grip them? Will it be on everybody's like iPhone, playing on Spotify, millions of views on YouTube?
Right.
Probably not. So it's not to say that, variation on music and genre and song style doesn't have its place. It certainly does.
Certainly.
But there's something very distilled at the core there.
Right. 3.5 minutes long. Again, having a chorus that repeats, so
Yeah,
people know
right.
that it's
People,
coming up again.
when the chorus is coming, everyone's like, ooh, like they get kind of like,
Right.
excited.
There's a rising in energy and
Yeah.
then a fall of energy,
Yeah.
and there's like a climax, and then you kind of end the song a certain way, and it doesn't mean that the format can't be messed with. And obviously, there have been very famous songs that have been 7 minutes long, and that can work, but still you're seeing a sort of a core thing in which different representations are orbiting
Right.
this thing. It's
Right.
organizing
Yeah.
around this core archetype, this formula, and that's the pop song.
Yeah.
In some sense, is orbiting this thing. And again, if you keep going with the Beatles, like it's also their personalities. It's the image. There's
Right.
all these archetypal things happening
Yeah.
in one package.
It's important to talk about the human element of it outside of like the pop song framework, because I think that's especially why it was so powerful. It's like not only did they sort of launch this rock and roll sort of pop evolution, but they themselves also were sort of harnessing unconsciously, this archetypal power inside of themselves, especially that each of them had kind of their own dynamic personality, but as a group, as a whole, they kind of represented something that people could grasp onto, like the rebellious nature and all of that. And so it shows the varying dynamics that are going on when a situation is drawing a lot of sort of archetypal power to it.
Right.
That you can actually just kind of break it down and look at the archetype in each of those individuals and them as a group and the songs themselves. And I think that's why they were like literally a phenomena. Like it's kind of all tied up into that experience.
Right. And so this energy that we're talking about, in which the archetypal quality of something can be harnessed and capitalized upon in some sense, that blows it up into such extreme proportions that you have things like the Beatles, like a supergroup. You have celebrities.
Right.
You have politicians, people that have aggregated all this attention, all this energy that people are readily throwing at them
Right.
in a way that we don't really question too much. But there's like these celebrity magazines. What is that?
Right.
Like, why does anyone care what these celebrities are doing in their free time? Like, why is that a thing?
Right. A lot of people care.
And a lot of people care. And you have to ask, what is that? What's happening?
Right.
Why are people throwing this energy at these celebrities?
Yeah.
And the more attention they get, the more attention they keep aggregating. And it kind of snowballs in this weird way.
Yeah. There is this tendency to sort of find something that feels almost bigger than ourselves sometimes, I feel, because we even look at the celebrity as, not literally like God in a spiritual sense, but in many ways they have been raised up onto this pedestal.
Right. I mean, the celebrity and a deity, I think, are tapping into the same archetype.
Yeah.
You know? And the archetype is not God.
Right.
I think a God is a reflection of the archetype, the same way the celebrity is. But there's something about raising a human-like thing up, and that might be playing on our tendency to want to pick a leader, or to recognize a leader, or to be conscious of power or status in some sense, even just from an evolutionary perspective. I think you can draw that back and say, clearly humans are tribal. Clearly humans recognize the need for a tribal leader. That's instinctual.
Yeah.
If you blow that out of proportion, you get celebrities, or you get a god or something like that.
And often, even at the degree of which it's religious and spiritual in nature, like an established sort of religious god to like a celebrity, in many ways they sort of inform you through their way of living how you should be too, right? Like people follow the trends of celebrities as if like their word is like the word of God. It's like, wow, this celebrity's doing this now.
Right.
Like you see that phenomena. That is why they are the faces of advertisements for products. It's like, oh, I, for some reason, deeply respect and believe in this image of this person, like Brad Pitt, and he's on the Coca-Cola commercial. Okay, yes, I want Coca-Cola.
Right, and that's not like a real conversation that someone's having with themselves, right?
Oh,
It's just totally unconscious.
Yes.
But you see Brad Pitt, and you're like, oh, and then you want to drink the soda in a way that like you're not making that rational connection. It just happens. And so again, that's archetypal.
Yes.
That's tapping into an underlying foundational structure of our psychology.
It's helping you navigate the world.
Right. So again, this notion of the archetypal niche, or the archetypal void, and the way that we kind of want to put things into those niches. And there is a niche for someone who is powerful, or someone who is a leader, or someone who we want to follow and get behind.
Yeah.
Clearly we do this instinctually.
Yeah.
Like, clearly if you don't notice this, then you're not really paying attention, I think. And just to be clear to our listeners, the Christian God is not just a celebrity. I want to be clear on that. It's far more complicated than that.
Right.
The notion, something that might be closer to that, is the notion of just a deity, or like I think like ancient like Greek gods or something like that might be a little bit closer to this notion of the deity. And the Christian God is something that's far, far more complicated than just celebrity power, I would say.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, but we can get into that in a different podcast.
Yeah.
Of course. So what we're talking about here, this archetypal energy that people are throwing at things, this can become perverted, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you might even say that the mother archetype might be a good example of a something archetypal that we are throwing energy at instinctually, not necessarily in a bad way, but
Right.
like the mother is important to us. A lot of investment is going in mom. There's all this meaning behind mom, and that can become something can break, something can become perverted or broken
Yeah.
and corrupted in that. And that's why we see this universal collective experience of people having problems with their parents, for instance.
Right. Well, mother's only human, and in many ways, she's holding the projection of the archetypal framework upon her. So, in an example where your mother may have done something wounding to you in childhood, and that starts to really like break down the sort of unconscious belief system that you had around that individual, it can be incredibly difficult and can sort of lead to that archetype becoming sort of associated with painful, difficult feelings and emotions and memories. And so, in a way, you might then approach mothering in general to become a mother yourself, maybe one day, or mother-like figures as something that you want to stay away from. That archetype has taken on a sort of perversion due to that like kind of personal flavor of what's been attached to it.
Right. And that's you just brought up sort of an interesting aspect of this, of the notion that the mother is a powerful archetype to us in the terms that we have a relationship with our own mother,
Yeah.
but we also become the mother
Yeah.
at some point, and that's an interesting aspect to the notion of the archetype, is ascending in some sense into a thing that was outside of you as a child and
Yeah.
very powerful, but you are becoming that thing. And that's interesting. The ways in which that can affect you, the ways in which that can create a pattern in your life.
Well, it can also be, I think, healing to the connection to the mothering, like the original mothering relationship. In if in this situation someone had a difficult childhood and a difficult relationship with the mother, later on becoming a mother or entering into a relationship where you have a child and watch your partner be a mother could actually be something that helps sort of retie those broken bonds for you, or at least sort of gives it some new energy and new associations to sort of feel that the dark sort of negative associations that you had beforehand are slipping away.
So we're tapping into this notion of complexes, and I think we can get into that. I think we have enough time to get into that. So archetypes, in some sense, are speaking to a organizing principle of our experience. We are processing our experience and placing it into packages or compartments. In some sense, that's not the best analogy, but we're organizing our experience, our memories, our interpretations, all these meanings that we encounter in our life. We're organizing those into the sort of building blocks of the individual.
Yeah.
And that is referred to as a complex.
Yeah, we're starting to get into more of the Jungian framework, and complexes, I think, is actually a word that's in the general lexicon, but has maybe only a one-sided connotation to it. Because I think people hear complex and they're just like, ugh.
Right, Oedipus complex.
Yes, inferiority complex.
Inferiority complex,
You know, we have these negative associations to it, but the idea of complexes was something that Jung really discovered when he was doing these word association tests back in his early career, and started to realize that when sort of giving people these random words, boat, tree, car, red, suddenly people seem to have these really strange reactions to certain words. So you might be like cat, tree, food, mother, and then the person might, in their reaction, be slowed. Maybe they the word that they said back to them was like pain or something. He started to notice these patterns around seemingly simple words, and what he built around that was this idea that complexes are these core sort of fundamental pieces of our psychology that have a lot of associations with them, experiences, feeling, toned, sort of emotional dynamics, but matched with that personal dynamic is an archetypal core.
Right. So the complex, in some sense, provides the nurture to the archetypes
Yes.
nature.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is, if we can think of the archetype as a structure of our psychology that's sort of built in, complexes are the information, the experience that we put into orbit around those archetypes.
Yeah.
So if the archetype is this core structural component, like a skeleton maybe, the complexes are the individual building up of that skeleton into a more fleshed out body.
Yeah.
And those become these building blocks that we create over our lifetime, and that is what makes up the individual.
Yeah. So the mother archetype has a mother complex. We all have a mother complex. And that's not to say that we all have a negative mother complex. It's neutral. It's neutral until we start to have experiences. So that's sort of twofold nucleus, part one being archetypal, part two being the nurturance, the personal experience starts to draw aspects to it. So when I was born, my mother cared for me. That's drawn to the mother complex. My mother introduced me to my favorite band. That's drawn to it. My mother taught me how to read.
Right.
My mother always cared for me when I was sick. Or my mother neglected me. That starts to turn that complex into something a little bit darker in nature. And so that brings us into the understanding of how the archetype anchors the personal experience. And as we live our life, we make all these associations, and they kind of constellate together.
Right.
They draw in to that orbit and create, more and more powerful association for our life and what it means when we hear the word mother.
Right.
And if we had a good, powerful mothering experience, you might say mother, and my word association might be love. But maybe I had a negative experience and it might be pain. So that's kind of where we start to explore that.
Right. And you have a mother complex whether or not you had a mother.
Yes.
Let's say.
Yes.
And if you are someone who very unfortunately grew up without a mother, let's say, that doesn't mean you don't have a mother complex because the archetype is there no matter what.
Yes, it's inherited.
It's inherited. You're born with, again, this archetypal niche, and you're going to readily fill that with a mother figure,
right?
Which is hopefully your mom is around. And if your mom's not around, that niche is still going to be there.
Right.
That's going to be a void, and it might be filled with other things that are trying to compensate for
Yes.
the mother.
Yes.
There might be just be the feeling of emptiness or a lack.
A lack, yeah.
In some sense. So this notion that the archetype is this compartment by which we organize our experience, and it's there no matter what.
Yeah.
And that really, this idea is complicated, and it's not perfect. Obviously, I mean, again, we're describing something that is incredibly complex, and the archetype, the notion of the archetype, the notion of the complex is in some sense a metaphor. It's not perfect. It's not totally scientific, but still. You can see this. You can see these patterns. You can recognize this in the way that people behave, in the way that they carry out their lives, is that we do have a collective, universal experience in life. And we all have the same patterns in life. There's all these... There's a reason there's stories about all these aspects of growing up, of, coming of age, of first kiss, of... first time you fell in love, first time your heart was broken, first time that you had a child. There's all these experiences that are universal to humans, and you can see this, and that's where this notion of archetype comes from. That's where this notion of complex comes from, is that you are building up a temple that is your life, that is you as an individual, and the bricks you are using are complexes, experiences, and those bricks are organized around archetypes. They're the structure, and you use that to build up your existence.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I've got a deck of cards with all different archetypes on it. And
Archetype cards.
Archetype cards, Carolyn Miss. So we are going to draw them at random and talk a little bit about them.
Okay.
Go ahead,
I'm
Arran.
going to pull an archetype card. Here we go. I pulled the Servant.
The Servant, all right.
Alyssa, what's the Servant?
Well, someone who's definitely giving to others, supporting others. Immediately, the association I'm thinking of servant is one in which there's certainly like a power dynamic happening.
Yeah, that's what serve implies.
Yeah. And I think that we naturally step into that role because we want to serve others in our life, both out of like love and compassion. Like certainly like parents serve their children.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people get a lot of joy out of being useful to other people and helping other people and making other people happy and comfortable.
It feels good in our nature to provide and nurture or to take on. I think that's part of also what I kind of feel with like the servant. It's like you're taking on some sort of weight. It's not necessarily something that has to be totally heavy in nature, but often there's that feeling that you are kind of doing something for another, and that might inherently lighten their load to a degree.
Definitely. That's part of the core of love is in some sense giving yourself away to someone else and not being paid in return for it.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
An aspect of the servant that I think all of us have a deep capacity to serve.
Yes.
But it can become, again, perverted or corrupted, or there can be a shadow side of that in some sense where someone thinks they are being altruistic when in fact they are just doing it for their own benefit, or they're just manipulating someone, or they want to think of themselves as being a good person, like, oh, see, I serve others. When in reality, you're not serving others.
Yeah.
And so there's potential around this archetype for all this variation of how you might manifest your interactions with other people.
Yeah.
And how it can be such a powerful tool for good and for joy in your life. And it can also be something we recognize in individuals as being, in some sense, kind of broken or warped.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, let's pull another one. The Lover.
The Lover. Well, this one's pretty prominent in our culture. There's definitely a lot of meaning and power behind that notion. The Lover. Well, obviously, all of us have a huge capacity for loving.
Yeah.
You might say it defines our entire existence in some sense as being someone that's capable of love.
Yeah.
It is, I would say, usually the main reason why people do what they do in life is out of love.
Right.
They're pursuing love. People find the most meaning out of love. People feel very, very messed up when they don't receive love.
Yeah.
And if someone is incapable of loving, we definitely recognize that as being like a very serious vice. But there's also the sexual aspect of this.
Yeah, definitely.
Archetypally, I would say it's pretty hard to separate sex and love.
Yeah.
We do separate it in our culture nowadays, but I would say archetypally, sex and love are tied into one another.
Right, especially when we think about the concept of the lover, my lover. It's like that's not your sibling. Like
right.
Your...
So that's what I'm referring to with this part. I'm not thinking of it as like brotherly love. I'm thinking it as
this is romantic love that we're dealing with here, as depicted by the picture of her holding a heart and looking very joyous, passionate.
Well, a human heart.
A human heart, yes. So passion, right? A sort of devotion to another individual that drives a lot of meaning, and also an important evolutionary function as well, right?
It's the evolutionary function, reproduction.
To reproduce.
So I don't know if anything is more archetypal than the lover.
Yeah, and I think that's also why there can be such a spectrum of complete, like, painful and difficult and heart-wrenching experience with the lover, because there's so much built into it. And when that becomes toxic in nature, or your devotion to it is destructive, it can wreak an incredible amount of havoc on somebody.
Yeah.
All right, we're pulling another one.
Okay. The damsel.
The damsel. Okay.
How do we think about the damsel? That's
Well,
very particular.
It is, because it's inherently a feminine natured personality dynamic that we're dealing with here. And one who is, you can think about, oh, they're in distress. Of course, that's very stereotypical. But the damsel also opens up the opportunity for the masculine psyche to come through and to, slay the dragon, or, overcome some challenge.
Right.
The damsel is kind of giving us the initial spark for some sort of more active element inside of us to awaken. So that's where I go initially with that.
Right. So a feminine archetype, it doesn't necessarily have to be manifested by a female.
Right.
Of course, even in our stories, this could be a role that's taken on by a male. But a feminine archetype, an individual who is open and receptive to some hero or some masculine figure to come and join with them, to merge with them in some sense. You could say it's the a state of being before the union or the marriage in some sense.
Yes.
And the damsel in the most classic Slay the Dragon Heroes story is someone who is waiting for the masculine energy to come and merge with them to make them more than they were before. And so the damsel, once she merges with a masculine energy, wakes up and maybe evolves into the mother.
Right. That unification principle inherently requires the balance of the masculine and the feminine. And so the damsel is one of those ways in which that story plays out. And we can harness within ourselves possibly a more active principle, to sort of compensate for what the feminine receptivity is opening up for. And that joining is where sort of like transformation can happen.
Right. And also for the masculine hero type, it's the damsel wakes up the masculine hero. What does the hero need? It's like he needs a feminine energy to make him more than he was before. And so that merging, in that sense, it depends, of course, but you could think of the damsel in some sense as a feminine counterpoint to the masculine hero in the story. Or almost the feminine version of the hero at some stage in the journey in some regard. And I think it's interesting to think about like the shadow aspect of a damsel archetype. It might be someone who is waiting for someone to rescue them or yielding their agency to someone else to take control and dominate them in some sense.
Right. The act of this in its more balanced state is one where the two parts, the masculine and the feminine, are meeting on equal ground, and power is held sort of reciprocally between the two. So that shadow one certainly talks to some sort of imbalance happening, where it's not really serving the ultimate goal.
Cool. Do you have a question for us? Do you have a dream you'd like us to analyze?
We want to hear from you. Contact us through the submission form, which can be found at our Instagram page at Golden Shadow Podcast. Or if you're listening on YouTube, you can find the link in the description below.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.
If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. These podcasts are only possible with the support of viewers like you.